This is a village called Hillsdale. It's halfway between Lake Simcoe and Georgian Bay. So the hotel on the corner was called the Halfway House, and because you would be using the two bodies of water for transportation, but then you would have to transport the 22 kilometers in between from one to the other. I had been in the city I graduated from the Art College, Ontario College of Art in 1970, and then I worked with the group of people that started A-Space, and then I went to the country and worked for a veterinarian for 6 months, and then I bought this building. It took me about a year to move into it and sort of set up shop and open up. And then, as I said, I spent a number of years just learning how to make things. And then I ran the shop for whatever came in the door for 4 or 5 years. I decided to go back to making sculpture. So my interest in work in general is the same work is basically what happens when one makes things and leaves it in public. How long does it? What does that mean over time? And so the years between my graduation, between 1970 and say 1978, were really years of development and invention. So the one thing that I invented was I decided that I wanted to use the animal as a kind of vehicle for myself. When I say that that's a vehicle, then it throws up various ideas of where do you want to get to. And basically you want to get to the sense of something that allows you to think through human relationships by not directly going to the human. The question then is, how can sculpture, which is just stuff, facilitate that? What I invented was to take a slab of steel and to do a very thick silhouette. And the silhouette works to anchor its spot. So it's life size, it stays in the space that it's in, and you're always outside of it because, of course, it's not something you pick up. So you are always sort of beside it. It's not like music in the sense that music's immersive. It's not like literature, which takes another way that your brain works. It just sits here in the world with you. And to go back to the beginning, that's why when I started with animals, it allowed you to both make a sculpture that you simply weren't trying to copy the literal animal, but somehow you were trying to get at something about your relationship with animals, either specifically or in general. When you think about animals, there's a whole series of ideas between humans and animals that are to do with some very basic relationships. So do we own all the animals in the world, or do animals have their own lives that are separate? So one of the reasons for doing a life-size animal is to say that they occupy the same space, even if we're not quite in the same world, because, of course, that's the whole interesting aspect of animals, is that our communication with them is quite varied and speculative, because we're always looking at and wondering what animals actually see. But at a certain point in time, you start to look from the other end of the scale. So I decided I would look at what it meant to make a full volumed body as an animal. And I decided I would use stars because I became quite fascinated with the sense that our source of human, well, the source of life is stardust and time. As I said, I find stars to be this one animating quality that is it's quite useful. So as an ongoing idea, because it's simply how do you keep this sense of life rolling on. So stars are a really interesting way to look at life. And of course, if you make them into a full-bodied form, then they're quite different from a slab of steel, which is very resistant, and they're much more porous. Well, I probably used stars for 20 years now, right? So my sense of sculpture being in public, so we're talking about making public sculpture, is that it can go on, it's sturdy, it can stay in public, and over time, it can evoke these various kinds of relationships depending on how you come across it and think about it. But it doesn't have to then be a specific meaning or reading. So that's one of the interesting things about time that takes place with public art, because trees can grow and all of a sudden, like, you're beating back all the bushes, you know, and then if you're in Toronto, condos can grow and they're harder to beat back, obviously. So to see a public work that gets taken care of is to realize their significance, that it gets accrued over time. So when the Bob Hunter family wanted to do a memorial, and they didn't want to simply represent Bob Hunter, they said, what can you do that gives something, evokes something about his spirit and what he desired for as a performance space, and which gets you into the idea of how does a performance space work. And then you realize, of course, that you have a relationship between the viewer and the stage. I ended up taking the trumpet and making two trumpets back to back, being held together by a split heart to structure them. By doubling the horns, you end up with the idea that the relationship is a two-way street between the stage and the spectator. And that's allows you to sort of both think about the object, but somehow think about the relationships between the viewer and the stage, right? Mm-hmm. So that's as opposed to saying this is music, because of course it's a thing, it's not music, but it has something about what music does, which is this joining, which is one good rationale for using a heart, because as a supporting mechanism for the two horns. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The interesting thing about stars is they give you that visceral sense of porosity always. Mm-hmm. So you think of that feeling in the context of what maybe Bob Hunter thought about when he made music, or when he imagined a stage that Barrie musicians could play on. The interesting thing about using stars was that it allowed a continuation of all kinds of things as opposed to specifically animals. So it seemed like an interesting way to build a horn for Bob Hunter. It's unlike a museum where a piece may be on display for a short time or a long time. It's always on display. And so one's coming and going from it allows for the full range of thoughts thinking about it. So you can think about the individual, and by and large, we think about the individual by attaching his name to it, which we've done. Every rule, you at some point in time, every rule you break a little bit to see whether you're thinking about it is accurate. But if you can have the confidence to work with material that does something very significantly important. What does it mean to make a long history about things? How many things, how can you articulate the range that takes place in those things, right? And so that's basically what I've spent most of my working life exploring.